Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ben Cotton came up with an interesting quotation earlier, which was, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, originally from Lord Kelvin. Now, the trouble is, looking at the green energy sector, practically all sectors in all different countries measure their CO2 emissions in different ways. And I chair a working group in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which amongst other things is going to standardise a methodology for measuring carbon emissions across different sectors in different countries, so that we know that we will have a level playing field for the next round of Copenhagen, which can only be a good thing. For my sins, I'm also on the board of ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, and I'm one of the champions for smart grids. So, get that right. That one. Nope. That one. Yeah. So, a quick run through this, because I know we're running out of time today. So, why do we need standards for smart grids? Who's driving them? What standards are needed? Who is producing those standards? And what's the next step? Got it. Now, earlier we said, we don't know what a smart grid is really, and there's a lot of definitions. Well, the EC thinks they know what a smart grid is, because they've established something called the Smart Grids Task Force. And this defines a smart grid very clearly as an electricity network that can intelligently integrate the actions of all users connected to it, including generators, consumers, and those that do both, in order to efficiently deliver sustainable, economic and secure electricity supplies. Are you any wiser? I don't know, but it probably is as good as any definition. The US Department of Energy defines it somewhat differently. They say a smarter grid makes this transformation possible by bringing the philosophies, concepts and technologies that enabled the internet to the utility in the electric grid. So that's clearly a search for a far more open way of attaching things to the grid and for having power flows in many directions. So it's clear from this that smart grids, yes, they are about power, but they're also about things like billing, e-commerce, subscription management, OEM functions, data models, connectivity, etc., etc., etc. So this is why there's an awful lot of companies involved in the smart grid ecosystem. And that's my attempt to win the prize for the most companies on a single slide today. But I have to thank Chris Hartshorn from Lux Research for providing me with this. But you can see that's a fraction of the 2,000 or 3,000 companies that are involved in smart grid in the US, for example, in some level. And if you're going to have all of those companies providing elements of the smart grid or services for the smart grid or whatever, at all sorts of different levels for different functions, then standards are absolutely essential. And I totally disagree with the guy earlier who said, the hub will have to be able to allow for different standards and all this sort of thing. Because without those standards, it's just going to become too complicated. You won't be able to sell your smart meter not only here, but in France and Germany, or Korea, Japan, the US, etc. You want to have, just as in telecoms we're moving to, or have moved to, you want to have products that you can deliver and use in any market in the world. So, that's my first point. There's also a wide range of communications technologies for the smart grid. Now, standards and interoperability are absolutely key for this, but I accept that geographies and regulation will differ from country to country, from region to region. But you can have basic building blocks. It's not just that dedicated DEC smart metering infrastructure network that will cost millions that will provide this. We'll use technologies ranging from power line to Zigbee to Wi-Fi to fiber. A whole range of technologies will actually provide this smart metering infrastructure. It's not going to be that single block investment. But again, standards are absolutely essential. I just go to the next slide first. This is a view we have of ICT and power. And there are a number of different planes. So you have your basic power and energy plane along the bottom there. The next level up, you have your control plane, hopefully some kind of IP-based network to provide the control information. And then you have the service plane at the top. And so you can look at the functions you need in the smart grid according to those three planes. And so going back to that slide, the smart grid ecosystem in terms of standards, again, it's still very complex, but you're starting to see some key standards there and a relationship between standards and regulations in the different regions in the different countries. So again, you have some key standards, which I'm not going to go through each one here, but for the energy plane, the control and connectivity plane, and the service plane. And bodies such as NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technologies in the US, are defining the essential standards at each of those layers. Europe is a little bit behind the US on this because the US have had a much greater requirement to upgrade their electricity grid because it's a bit flakier than the European one at the moment and tends to be less robust and fail more often. So, a very simple diagram, and it raises more questions than answers, but there are a few key interfaces there between the grid, the smart meter, the home, and the service provider here. Now, I don't just mean the electricity service provider, but this open market for service provision that will allow all sorts of ICT companies to add value here in an open fashion. Now, when I put that slide up last week in the Smart Grids workshop in the ETSI board, the most questions I got were about the internet there. What is the role of the internet? And one of the key criticisms of the electricity generators regarding allowing telecoms providers into this is they're not robust and reliable enough. You couldn't possibly rely on the internet, could you, for this? But what I'm saying is that, in fact, the internet will provide a basic communications mechanism for all of this, and it will be sufficient for many, many services that you're going to need to provide. Now, the EU have just woken up to this about a year ago, and they issued a Smart Grids Directive last July, and that is that member states should encourage the modernisation of distribution networks, such as through the introduction of smart grids, which should be built in a way that encourages decentralised generation and energy efficiency, which sounds very good. And they've created an EU Smart Grids Task Force, which has a steering committee and 3 expert groups. And the interesting thing is that they're about to produce their draft reports, okay? So there's expert group 1 on the functionalities for smart grids and smart meters, which is defining the requirements, the architecture, and things like the use cases. Then you've got expert group 2, which is looking at the implications for regulation. Things like data privacy, data security, data protection, and all this sort of thing. And it's very interesting that, because it was referred to earlier about the Dutch experience, where they tried to mandate the use of smart meters in the home. And it was voted down, and they couldn't do it. Now, the trouble is, in order for a smart metering infrastructure to work, you've got to have about 80% penetration. Otherwise, it's not effective. But the EC says you must only do this on a voluntary basis. So there's a huge issue of trust here, which has to be overcome before smart grids are going to work at all. So it has to be voluntary, and it has to be trusted. And the consumer must know what is going to happen to their data and who's in control of it. And then the third expert group is on the roles and responsibilities of the actors involved in the deployment of smart grids. And I'm traditionally from a telecommunications operator. And when I went into this world, I was absolutely amazed that they didn't recognize telecommunications operators as service providers. To them, a service provider is an electricity service provider. And telecoms companies are not given any role at all, really, in this. And so the first thing was to, quotes, educate them. But there's a huge gulf here between them. Anyway, the recommendations are due this month, so I've seen the draft recommendations already, and they're now being commented on and refined. And there's another document expected in about 6 months' time, which will provide or work towards an EC mandate in this area for standardization. That's their process for developing a standards roadmap. It's very similar to the NIST one. Reuse existing standards as much as possible, build on those which you have a consensus around, and standardize application enablers rather than applications so that companies have the opportunity to add value and build on the standards and create that open market. They started off with a smart metering mandate. Okay, now this was issued last year, and the main objective of that is to build standards for European smart meters, allowing interoperability and consumer actual consumption awareness. In other words, so they can find out how much electricity they're using. The trouble is that the meters are out there at the moment don't work to the same standards, and it's essential to have a common market in this area so that you can use different meters in different countries. And that timescale is going to be about a 2-year one till it's finished. The ETSI view of this is you can just use machine-to-machine applications and use smart metering as the simply first M2M application. That hasn't got the buy-in yet of the electricity providers, but it's a good approach because it's trying to use a generic infrastructure. A bit more about NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US. That's adopted a 3-phase plan for smart grid interoperability and a framework and roadmap. It's about 150 pages, so I don't recommend you reading it tonight, but it's got a list of 100-odd key standards that will be important, plus I think it's 16 or 17 priority action plans for filling the gaps in those standards that are still needed. So it's things like standards for plug-in electric vehicles and that sort of thing. I think I better speed up, hadn't I? Finally, the ITU focus group on smart grids. This was just started last week. This is trying to produce global standards for smart grids that will work in any country and identify the impact on standards development. And this is led by Les Brown from Lantik in Germany, and you can see the global nature of this. We have vice chairmen from Korea, China, Japan, and the US. And it's working in collaboration with NIST, IEEE, and the IEC, and many other bodies actually. And so it's trying to produce some kind of common denominator standard which can be applied anywhere. And that was last week in Geneva. There's a URL there for further information. 48 people, 27 documents, etc. They had an initial studies list, and the next meeting will be on the 2nd to 5th of August. Not only ITU members can go to that, but any member of any company can go, because it's a focus group, not a study group. In a year's time, when it becomes a working party or a study group, then it will be again limited to ITU members. But it's progressing.